Hello, this is an interview on behalf of the ESCoE Conference 2020, and we're very glad to be able to talk to John van Reenen, one of our keynote presenters. So, John, thank you very much for your fascinating talk to the conference. Now, I suppose I'd like to ask you first the question to which I'd most like the answer. What do you think can be done about Britain's productivity shortfall? And do you think that in practice, the gap with the more advanced European and countries and the United States could be closed in reasonable time?
Well, that's the big question, I suppose, that we'd all like to know the answer to. I mean, there's lots of different questions. I suppose the thing which relates most closely to the talk I've just given would be, obviously, I think that management is important for understanding some of these cross-country gaps. So one of the things to think about would be how to raise the quality of management in this country. And I suppose I broadly think about that in two ways. This is not just specific to the UK, but it's more general to lots of countries. One could think about kind of structural policies, the kind of traditional economic policies that we do to try to change the environment to get firms to improve the management, or we could think of more direct policies to do interventions in terms of helping firms, especially, say, small and medium-sized enterprises. So in the first group of policies, what we have certainly found in a lot of our work is that skills are very important for thinking about improving management. So one of the areas where the UK seems to be worst on is, as the National Institute, as when you were there, as always emphasised, is the kind of role of kind of intermediate skills, the kind of education and the training of people who have left school and not necessarily going to university. So that would be an area I think would be important to think of in terms of those types of skills. The other area in the UK is that one of the other kind of and this is not a big necessarily the largest thing, but one of the other areas in the UK that we've seen is that we tend to have more family-run firms actually than many other certainly more than the US, and actually more than we do in Germany and France. So we should think a little bit about either how we help those firms in terms of providing different training programs, benchmarking information, and also whether we want to encourage. At the moment, the inheritance tax regime kind of encourages family ownership. So it's not obvious that's necessarily a great policy there. Moving on to the kind of more direct type of thing. So I think the work as a whole suggests that there could be a role for informational interventions. So helping firms benchmark and offering training programs. The reason I'm often reluctant to say this is the solution is that we just don't have great information on say in the UK, on the type of programs which actually are successful. So the government, the BEIS and government programs often have lots of, business training programs, but they're not generally rigorously evaluated. So that's the kind of area where I think there's kind of a lot of opportunity potentially to improve management, but whether they actually are going to work, could we replicate what we did in India? I think that's an open question, and that just needs to have more evaluation of those types of policies. So there's a third thing actually as well, which I often don't talk about, which is competition. So competition is clearly one of those things where I think there's a lot of evidence that that's been a driver for improved management. I've always had the view, I think that Britain has relatively strong competition policy, and also has been quite pro competition and pro openness to trade. My worry, of course, is that we might be moving in the wrong direction in the kind of post-Brexit period if we end up with having greater trade costs if we went to a situation where there was, weakening our competition environment. So that's more of a kind of concern for the future. So that's on management. But if you wanted me to ask you the much more general thing, not just about management, what should the UK do, or what are the problems of the UK? I'd have to go beyond what I talked about in my talk, which I'm happy to do. But do you want me to do that, or do you want me to focus on?
Well, I'd be very grateful if you could go.
Okay, so then looking just much more widely, then I was involved with this thing called the LSE Growth Commission a few years ago with Tim Besley, and also with there's been a follow up to that. So we thought a lot about these type of issues in terms of thinking about what what could be done. I think that one of the issues, it seemed to me, which came out of that, and from talking to lots of people, was that the UK seems to have not be so good at dealing with doing long run investments. So if we think about transport or infrastructure or energy investments, it seems to be very hard for the UK to actually make those type of commitments to long run stable investments. And that's just obviously it's partly a question of money and resources. Those are often things which get cut very quickly in times of crisis. We saw that happening after the global financial crisis. A lot of the cutbacks initially came in the form of public investment. But more broadly, it seems to be that we don't do those things as well as we should do. And our view, and my view, was that this seems to be partly related to our kind of very adversarial political culture, that we have a very fast news cycle, quick rotation of ministers and all the rest of it. We need to think about how we can develop different institutions which are more resilient and long-term looking to deal with some of those things. So we proposed, and I think that was partly taken up, this kind of National Infrastructure Commission, which I think is a good organization, although it's had some issues, to try and help with making these long run decisions. I think the kind of business bank is also a kind of good idea in the way of trying to create institutions to channel money into longer run investments. So I think there is a set of issues around those kind of longer run type of investments. And the final thing on that would be, if I thought about the big three long run investments, would be around human capital, infrastructure. The third one would be around innovation, research and development. Those types of kind of investments, innovation, I think, are also areas where there's kind of room for improvement. Have I got a magic bullet for those? I don't think I kind of have. I do think that it's important to the future prosperity of all countries, including ours, to have serious investment in research and development and other parts of innovation. And I think there's different ways that could be. I think that could be enhanced.
Could I ask you a bit more, please, about what you've said on infrastructure? I mean, when I go to Germany, for instance, I read stories of a motorway bridge that's been closed for months because no one can decide whose job it is to repair it. It's on the boundary between two states, near Mainz, and also, I mean, the Germans have become worried about the state of their infrastructure. But do you think that despite that, they are at a considerable advantage relative to us, or they've put more money into infrastructure in the past and they're still enjoying the benefits?
Yeah, I don't know enough about Germany to all Mainz to give you a sensible answer to that. And my impression was that Germany traditionally has been better on that than we have. I mean, I certainly in the UK, think about all the trials and tribulations we've had over the terminal at Heathrow. and that's how long that went on. And we still haven't kind of made a decision on that. It certainly seems to me that we do have problems in trying to make those type of long run commitments in transport and energy, and those do seem to be related to the kind of very kind of short-termist political culture that we have. I mean, it's not to say that those problems are not also true in other countries, but that would be an area I think where we could make some improvements on. I was thinking, I mean, again, often this comes down to the politics of it. If we wanted to, think about improving housing development in the southeast, where we know we still have undersupply, how could we do that? And then we have the issues of, maybe this is similar to your issue in Germany, that there is a lot of a local opposition to actually having those developments, often for good reasons, because people don't want to have nice places spoiled. But if you need to build more houses, you have to think of a way of doing that. And there should be ways of somehow giving local councils and local authorities more benefits from spending the political capital to try and get those developments done. And that may be part of the whole decentralization agenda, that you actually allow some more of those benefits to be kept by the kind of local agencies, local politicians, and this may actually give them more of a political will to stand up against some of the NIMBYism that is faced. So that may be something. Maybe there's the same problem in Germany. I just don't know the German case well enough to talk sensibly about that.
I mean, I suppose that raises the question, how you actually do that. I remember a colleague of mine saying, or former colleague of mine saying, that if you allowed development on the green belt round Cambridge, you could give £1 million to each household in Cambridge and it would still be worthwhile. Now, if those calculations are correct, then of course it ought to be possible to clear the gap, but we don't actually have the mechanisms for doing that. The land belongs to the people who own it, not to the local authority, and the local authority can't appropriate it to give it to the residents who are objecting to the development. I mean, is there a fundamental issue of property rights there?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously, it's going to be harder in some places than it is in others, and it's going to be too expensive to buy out people. But I think that, I mean, my impression is that it's, in some cases, it's kind of it's a little bit more ambiguous, because often the property is not wholly owned by individuals. It might be partly owned by different groups, different developers. So there may be a room in which you could get some political will to get compromises going in order to kind of do that. I mean, often when I was going around, when I was doing the LSE Growth Commission, talking to people, the thing was, the view was, well, why should we, we know it would be good to maybe push and get some kind of housing developments in this area, but it's going to cause us so much political flack. And what's the benefit for us? All we'll do is get political flack for this, and not any of the benefits. So somehow, if you could, I mean, sometimes I've heard, you could think of maybe having larger political areas. So, like, one of the successes people say of the Manchester Combined Authority is that you could get lots of the different groups in one organisation, and therefore you can do more trade-offs. So there's a set of kind of political trade-offs you can do within a larger kind of combined authority than you could if you were a more disaggregated one. But that requires a lot of consensus and political will to do that, which may sometimes be lacking.
Could I ask you to speculate about how far you think those sorts of issues are likely to be affected by what we've learned from the epidemic? I mean, we have, or many of us have been working from home and have got used to that perhaps in a way that we certainly didn't anticipate. Now, that could reduce pressure on land in the southeast because people can work more remotely, or do you think actually it will encourage people to want to move to the outer suburbs and rural areas and increase the problem you're describing?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. I mean, I think that one of the phenomena, the pre BCE, before COVID epidemic, and for the decades before that, we were kind of witnessing the kind of growth of superstar cities like London, and you see this all over the world in the US, like San Francisco and Boston, and that seemed to be, just companies wanted to locate there, people wanted to live there despite all the costs. And now, with the pandemic, we've seen that, for both the why do people want to live in places like London, which are so horribly expensive? Well, one is that you get these kind of better ideas for mingling with people, other high human capital people, and also people like going out. So you go out and see your friends, and if the pandemic shifts that equilibrium, so that we're not really mingling so much face to face, we're doing it on Zoom like we are now, and it's much harder to go out, then there will be less of a desire, I think, for people to locate in these kind of expensive urban centres. And then the question is, well, where will people live? I mean, I think that potentially you can live anywhere, right? I mean, you could live in a much cheaper place in a much lower density neighborhood. So one scenario is that the whole phenomenon of very expensive places in London and maybe other high density cities, that price premium goes down, and this will make it easier to deal with. There won't be such a need to have housing developments in these very expensive areas. I don't know the answer to that. I think that there will be some of that happens, because I think people have learned that working from home is easier, and companies have made the investments in technologies like Zoom and Microsoft Teams and everything else to make it easier. But I still think those fundamental forces of agglomeration, that there is some benefits to face-to-face, are still important and are difficult to fully replicate on an online platform. So I do think, hopefully, when a vaccine comes along, that there will still be strong forces to live in the center of these superstar cities, although they'll be weaker than they were before. But we don't know. I mean, this is very much in the kind of speculative area. I mean, I would say that I have been, I've been surprised over the last 20 or 30 years how places like London, San Francisco, Boston, New York, how the prices just continue to go up for house prices, and people want to live in there despite you would think the congestion costs and everything else. So there must be some very strong forces, I guess the Marshalian agglomeration forces, which were behind that. So I don't think those are completely going to go away, but I think they're likely to be weaker than they were before the pandemic.
More generally, could I invite you to speculate, please, on what you think the impact of COVID is going to be on productivity? So perhaps looking at how you think things might settle down in 5 years' time, after we hope we've got a vaccine and have got beyond the infectious stage of the disease.
Wow, that's a great question. So, I mean, obviously, I've been focused more on the short term in terms of thinking about this, and of course, in the short term, it's not good at all, as we know. Maybe not as bad as maybe we might have thought. Construction was certainly bad, and I guess there's two. I mean, one question, of course, is there going to be, how deep will the recession be, and will that persist? So, that. A negative scenario is that we don't handle the emergence from the pandemic well, and we end up with a prolonged recession, L-shaped, whatever you want to call it. That would be bad for productivity. When we get the vaccine and we go beyond this, there is this in relates to what we just said, there is going to be this aspect of where, you know, we've been kind of forced into a new equilibrium of, you know, using lots of communication technologies like Zoom as we are now, and working with distance that we probably wouldn't have done to the same speed that we had before. So that, you know, that gives a boost of technological investments, which can have positive productivity impacts. Many of those areas, I suppose, like, you know, the UK has strengths in parts of developments of that type of software. It has strengths in the kind of, you know, as we've seen for vaccine developments and medicine, strengths there. So there may be some benefits to the UK for having that. But I think in general, I think the even when we get the vaccine, I think the lingering uncertainty about future pandemics, about future lockdowns, about the fragility. I mean, another aspect of this is the kind of the fragility of global supply chains. So I think, unfortunately, that, you know, we're probably going to enter, as we were already doing, an era of deglobalization, where there are more barriers put up to trade, more things are taken away from global supply chains to be locally sourced. And, you know, I actually think that on balance is not going to be a good thing for productivity. I think, you know, having more trade barriers, having more barriers to trade, those are actually going to be negatives. So the communication side might be a positive, like we're doing now, and those things. But I think my kind of concern is that there will be a growth of more inward-looking aspects and more barriers to trade, which are going to be are going to make the system more fragile.
Well, thank you very much for those thoughts. Are there any final comments you'd like to make before we wrap up, please?
You ask very hard questions, Martin. It makes me think I should be thinking about these in more depth than I have. I mean, I think that I like to end on a bit more of optimism, because I think we are living through very very difficult times. And we thought, you know, the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, is like, you know, once in a lifetime, but we've seen that this is also what we're having to go through now is also, you know, a deeper and harder shock. But the way I would think about it is the following: is that when we've had, you know, big crises like this in the past in the UK and Europe and the world in general, you know, there's two broad responses to it. One is the negative response. You know, I was, you know, my last remarks were the kind of inward lookingness, and we retreat back behind walls and barriers. And that's a bit like what happened after World War I. The other thing is what happened after World War II, and we kind of use this as an opportunity to think about, well, there's, you know, a different way of doing business. There's a different way of organizing things. There's a new set of possibilities of tackling some of the longer run problems that we've had. And I kind of hope the second is the one what we do, that this kind of the pandemic shock can actually make us realize that, you know, perhaps the direction of travel that we were going in prior to the pandemic, the kind of, you know, the trade wars, the increasing inward lookingness, that's not the way to go. And we should take what we learned after the Second World War, which is that we need to have, you know, an international rules-based system. We need to have more global cooperation. We need to make investments in research, development, technology to really bring us as a society and economy into a better world. So, you know, I hope we go for the second and not the first, and we take the lessons from the Second World War from the pandemic rather than the First World War.
Well, thank you very much on that optimistic note, or at least identifying an optimistic route. Perhaps we should wind up, but it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation on top of the really interesting lecture that you kindly gave.
Well, thank you, Martin, for taking the time to both chair the lecture and also to cross-examine me with the questions. I mean, enjoyed both very much.
Well, it's kind of you to say that. Many thanks.
Bye.